welcome to another episode of Questionare here at the Build Lab. Today I'm joined as always by Toño Montes, an IR and political science student at the university, and Dr. Samuel Stone, our teacher here at the university for the law department. Today we will be discussing our usual topics of vaccines and migration because they will continue to be the topics of the year, hopefully only this year. And then we will also touch a bit on other topics concerning Latin America and the US's relationship with Latin America. First, we have the news that the New York City has announced that they plan to make this vaccine tourism more available. This is the first time that an authority from the US has openly said that tourists will be getting a vaccine, aside from the governor of Alaska. So first, the governor of Alaska announced that tourists could get the vaccine at Alaskan airports during the summer. And then a few days ago, Mayor de Blasio announced that in the state of New York, well, especially in New York City, they will be having bans in these touristic sites where you can get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. What's your take on it, Dr. Stone, and what do you think made it possible to get to this point?
Hi, yeah, well, it's good to be back here with everybody. I think there are a couple of things. One is that, especially in New York, vaccination rates are very high. So pretty much everybody in New York City, who wants to get a vaccine has already gotten it. And I think this is increasingly becoming true across the United States, right? We see many places where they have an enormous number of vaccine doses that are either going to waste or that are being stored long-term because people just don't want to get the vaccines, right? Everybody pretty much who wanted to get a first dose got a first dose weeks and months ago. I don't think there's anybody that I know in the US who is not at this point fully vaccinated. It's just that simple. So that's part of it. We have the doses in the States, they're there. And I think in more progressive circles, the idea is, well, why not in some way or another share them, right, with the rest of the world? Why not try to get more people vaccinated overall? And of course, a good way to do that is, hey, if you get a lot of tourists like New York City, get them a vaccine. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is also just that, if people are coming to your city, right, like if you're coming to New York on vacation, well, then you might be bringing the virus back with you. And so, again, there's no good reason not to vaccinate them and add sort of, have them be protected or at least partially protected, depending on how long your trip is, while they're in New York City. So I think we're going to see this in many other places. We know that unofficially, many locations have been doing this, right? Florida, at the beginning, was pretty much just open to anybody showing up and getting a vaccine. Then Governor DeSantis, a Republican, basically said, no, you can't do this anymore. We're going to require proof of Florida residency. However, there are many locations providing vaccines in Miami and in Orlando, at least, that's where I know of them, that are vaccinating Latin American people who are going up to the States to get vaccines, no questions asked, right? We know that in Texas, this has made the news in the US and Mexico. Many locations in Texas, pretty much all of them, as far as I know, are just vaccinating anybody who shows up, no ID required, no proof of Texas residency. And people are just, going from Mexico and from other countries to get vaccinated in Texas. So we've been seeing this unofficially for a while. Now we're starting to see it more from, as you said, the governor of Alaska, right, is a Republican. So we're starting to see it from politicians of both parties in the US. And I think this is just going to expand from here, especially in progressive places, but probably at least unofficially everywhere, right? I mean, medical providers are going to be happy to be able to give somebody a vaccine instead of the vaccine going to waste or just sitting in a freezer somewhere. So this is, I think this is a positive development, something that needed to happen, and it's tied into the fact that we're now reaching this level, right, in the United States, where pretty much everybody who wanted to be vaccinated has been vaccinated. And, some people don't want to get vaccinated. Some people are hesitant. Some people just haven't made the time, right? They don't have easy access to them. But for whatever reasons, we now have supply that outstrips the demand. And that's going to make it easier to justify for politicians giving vaccines to foreigners, whether that's sending them to their countries or vaccinating people in situ in the United States.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. As you say, there's the option of sending men out to countries, but that's also a bit of a problem because, as we've discussed before, the Trump administration made the contracts that the US could not donate these vaccines. They had to sell them. So it will be interesting to see if the Biden administration tries to make amends into these negotiations, or if they will continue to do like they did in Mexico, where they supposedly sold them. But we all know that it was a quid pro quo, where it was you put your National Guard on the southern border, and then we will give you vaccines. Antonio, Professor Stone had this very interesting point where he basically said that the people that want to get vaccinated have been vaccinated, and we've seen in some cities across the U.S. that for all those people that have been hesitant about the vaccine, they've been offering freebies, they've been offering money, they've been offering beers. What's your take on this? Do you think that this will be good for the campaign against vaccine hesitancy, or do you think that it will just be the same?
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Dr. Stern, for joining this episode with us. And I think it's crazy to see that there are some countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, some parts of the Middle East that are not getting one single vaccine till 2023 or 22 probably. And there are some cities in Europe, in the United States, Europe referring as the continent, there are some countries that still have people that do not want to get vaccinated for some reason or another. And it seems unreal that there are counties in the United States that they just have been able to get 15, 16% of their population vaccinated, not because they're not having the conditions to vaccinate them, simply because they don't want to get vaccinated. Again, nobody can force you to get a vaccine. There is no law that requires you to get the actual vaccine. But again, if we want to end this pandemic, we all need to get vaccinated as soon as possible. So this dualism seems to be from another world, to think that there are some countries that are not getting the vaccine until 2023, and there are some countries that already have the vaccine and their citizens do not want to get vaccinated. And I think Dr. Stones makes a pretty good point that I want to complement. And in these times, the best economic policy is to get vaccines, to get people vaccinated. Not only because you reactivate the economy, you open the schools, you open business, you open sports events, you open entertainment, you make the finances go through into the country, into the cities. You reactivate the economy. And as of today, the only way to fully reactivate the economy, or to try to reactivate it completely, is to get the most amount of people vaccinated. We have seen that President Biden has said that by the 4th of July, he expects to have the country back to normal, basically, or the most close way to the normality that we used to know before the pandemic struck the world. And I think that opening and fostering this vaccine tourism is good for the United States because, again, reactivates the economy. Tourism brings money, reactivates the economy, reactivates local business, the flights get stuck. Again, you reactivate the economy. That is a point that everyone was so hesitant about. This balance with health or economy. It seems that this tourism vaccination process meets both requirements for taking care about people's health and taking care about the economy. So I think it's a pretty interesting policy. We'll yet to see whether more cities or more states in the US and other parts of the world make official tourism vaccination. We have seen like the United Arab Emirates and Israel and also Russia trying to achieve similar tourist vaccination plans, but we're yet to see some other cases.
Yeah, I think what you close with is interesting because we only hear about vaccine tourism in the US because we're in Mexico and most people are only going to the US for vaccine tourism. Most people are not taking a flight from Mexico to Russia just to get the vaccine, whereas a lot of people are just crossing the border to get it. But it's also happening in a lot of other countries. There's even in Africa, we have people from South Africa crossing over to Zimbabwe to get the vaccine. We have people from India going to Russia, going to the States. It's a phenomenon like all around the world. It's not a contained thing. And at the end of the day, it's a privileged thing because you have to be able to pay for the fare. You have to be able to pay for your stay there. It's not an easy trip, but it has its pros and cons for everyone. But I think if we delve into that, we will lose all of the program into that. And I also want to touch on the topic of the meeting between Kamala Harris and President López Obrador. But before that, just as a reminder for our viewers, right before the meeting, during one of his Mañanera conferences, which is basically where the president goes and gives a monologue about what he's doing, 80% of it is lies. Like, it's been certified by an NGO that he lies a lot on it. But he announced that he had written a diplomatic message to the US about USAID funding for the NGO Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, which is basically an NGO that works with fighting corruption and impunity here in Mexico. And they've been critical of President López Obrador. And he said basically that the USAID funding them is violating the principles of mutual respect between both countries, and also that it is violating the principle of non-intervention from the US into Mexican political affairs. So I want to hear your take on it, Dr. Stone. Why do you think he announced that on the morning, but then he didn't discuss it at all during his meeting with Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I'll say one more thing real quick just about the vaccines. It is definitely a thing about the haves and don't haves. It's definitely an issue of privilege, because not only do you need to have the money to make the trip, which, as we know, right, the vast majority of people in developing countries don't have, but you also need to have a visa, right? For most of these countries, you need to have a visa. If you're coming from a developing country, you need to have a visa to enter. And to get those visas is often very difficult, often requires you to prove that you have money in bank accounts, that you own property, that you have reasons to return to your country. The U.S. in particular is very intensive in its tourist visa screening process, and it's definitely leaving most people in the developing world, in a position where they can't even go to the U.S. even if they wanted to, or to another country, right, to get a vaccine. The other thing I'll say real quick is that the countries that seem to be focused on vaccine tourism right now are countries like Israel and the UAE, which you said are doing this, that have a high rate of vaccination. So, I think that's why we're in the US, we're going to see it more. Okay, going on to this question of López Obrador and Vice President Harris meeting. One, as we said before, President López Obrador has sort of a maximalist view of state sovereignty and what it means to do non-intervention and so on, right? And his view, which is sort of an extreme version of what we call the Estrada doctrine in the foreign policy world, basically says you cannot say or do anything that even appears to be interfering with how we do things internally in our country, no matter what, right? No matter whether there's human rights abuse, no matter what, you just don't mess around, you don't intervene. It's not a crazy doctrine, but the way that he has interpreted it sometimes goes, I think, beyond what many scholars and many other people think is what the doctrine says. So, for example, it basically comes down to what do you see as sovereignty, right? The U.S. and other countries, not only developed countries, have often thought that sovereignty is not as expansive, or at least in some ways not as expansive, right? So economically supporting a group, a nonpartisan group that is in favor of eliminating corruption and eliminating impunity in a foreign country is not seen as being a violation of sovereignty in the United States. But under this government, at least, and their sort of vision of sovereignty, of state sovereignty in Mexico, that sort of activity is seen as a violation of the sovereignty of another state. So I think what we're having here are two things. One is just that President López Obrador does have a very maximalist ideological position on state sovereignty, and that's one part of it. And the other part of it is that I think he's trying to play with sort of nationalist sentiments in Mexico that were very pervasive maybe 40 years ago. I'm not sure how pervasive they are now, right? But during the Cold War and even in the 90s and early 2000s, right, there was some feeling of, especially amongst older people, the U.S. is interfering with us. The U.S. is intervening in our internal affairs. The U.S. is, basically trying to tell us what to do. And that was perhaps true, right? The U.S. has a long history of not positive interventions, to put it that way, in Latin America, including in Mexico, right? The U.S. has intervened in pretty much every single Latin American country over the last 100 years or so, including in Mexico. And so there were a lot of people, I think there still are amongst the older segment of the population, that do have this feeling of, we want to stand up to the U.S. and not let the U.S. tell us what to do, right, with our internal affairs. I don't think that's as effective today as it might have been if he was president even just 30 years ago. but I think he thinks it is. And playing with sort of these nationalist sentiments was very effective for the old ruling party, the PRI, right, during the 20th century. And I think he's trying to do that again. Whether it'll work or not, I don't know. Again, I think he knows that there's nothing they can really do to change the situation, but he wants to make sure that he's sending the message right to the internal public, to the public within Mexico, that this is, that he's standing up to the United States. And then separately, he knows he has to work with the United States, and so he's working with the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a great take. Tonya, from a diplomatic point of view, what's your take on him sending this note right before the meeting where he was going to ask for money from the US?
Well, I do believe that President López Obrador is a pretty strong supporter of the Westphalian state view, the one created in 1648. He does not understand quite well that we live now in a globalized world, and that denouncing and also standing up for corruption, against corruption and impunity, is not some sort of form of interventionism, or is not some form of a violation of the sovereignty. His understanding of sovereignty is pretty different than the sovereignty that probably the officials of USA have as an understanding of sovereignty. I do believe that he thinks that everyone that is not with him or that not supports his policies, no matter which topic we're referring to, is his enemy, or is his opposition. I didn't wanted to say the word enemy, but I think that's what he calls them, his enemies, his adversaries, I believe. But the thing is that I think we can see this as a smart move from him, from a local perspective, trying to focus on what he wants to achieve regarding the Mexican people. He wants to take this feeling that is the United States is a cause of Mexico's problems, a feeling that was pretty common in the 19th century, parts of the 20th century, but he wants to make it back. Although he signed TEMEC, the new renegotiation of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is Mexico, Canada, United States treaty, in which there's a lot of strong bonds regarding cooperation, economic alliances, and a lot of other subjects. But at the end of the day, I think López Obrador wants to point out, or wants to focus that if something wrong happens, it will be because the United States put money on it, or found this sort of interference into the Mexico's internal affairs. And also he needed to say that because we're going through a terrible crisis regarding an accident that happened in the Mexico City subway, where 23 people died, and there's around 80 people heavily, seriously injured. So he needed to draw the attention to other point, that it was not the accident of the Mexico City subway, and he believed that referring that to USA as an agency that was founding the opposition in Mexico was a smart move. And again, he met already with Vice President Harris. I don't know quite well if that was a point in the meeting. I don't believe it, but I think that was the logic in his move. It wasn't a pretty diplomatic move or a smart move to make, seeing it from a global perspective, but from his perspective at what he wants to achieve, I think it was a smart move.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point, because for us as people that study international relations or that work in this field, we tend to look at it from a more global perspective and sometimes forget to look at it from a more local perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things
go
about
ahead.
that, right? I mean, one, he is popular in Mexico, right? His popularity has come down a lot since he was elected almost 3 years ago, but he is still hovering around what, like 55-60% popularity, which in a country with three main parties and multiple smaller parties, many of whom are going to launch their own candidates for president in a few years, that's a lot, right? It's not just a plurality, it's an outright majority, and it's a number that many politicians in other countries would love to have. The second point is that we have an election, right? Just as I think here in Mexico, we kind of take it for granted that everybody knows, right? But in the US, we have our midterm elections are in June, right, next month. And all of Congress, both houses of Congress are up for re-election. For the first time ever, Congress will be able to seek re-election. There used to be a one-term limit. Now you can seek re-election. Many governors are up for election. City council, or some governors, but mostly all of the
15 out of 32 states. And we don't
yeah.
have the Senate. The Senate is until 2024, so it's only the
You're
House.
right. I'm sorry. You're correctly right. Yeah, but it's the House, and you've got mayors right across the country. It's a big election, and so everybody's angling for that, right? How is this election going to play out? It'll be an election where López Obrador himself is not on the ballot, but his party is, right? And so how will his party do, when people aren't coming out to vote for him? I think 3 years ago, many people came out and voted for him and just then happened to vote for everybody else in his party. So there are a lot of questions here, and they're trying to do what they can as the ruling party to try to stay in power, which is of course what parties do. And everybody else is trying to get him out of power, right? The other three parties have made an alliance. The other three main parties have made an alliance, even though they're supposedly ideologically completely different in many places, to try to get his candidates, López Obrador's candidates, out of office and so on. So I guess my point is we need to think about all this in the context of what's happening politically in Mexico. All of these big crises, like for example, the whole situation with General Cienfuegos that happened at the end of last year, which I saw and many of us saw as a huge sort of diplomatic faux pas, don't really hurt his popularity within the country. Like people within Mexico don't really care as much about those things. And so, it's worked for him so far politically, domestically. That's what he cares about. And so I think that's also part of the reasoning here.
Yeah, and you make an excellent point about what actually might cost him his popularity, because for Donald Trump, we know that a big fact, aside that he had a strong opposition in Democrats, there was also the fact of his terrible management of the pandemic, and that made a lot of people vote against him. But López Obrador has also had a terrible management of the pandemic, and yet he still has a big approval rating. So it's really hard to understand, even as a person that lives here, that talks to people with different political views and everything. It's really hard to understand how people keep on justifying some of his actions. But back to the international sphere, let's talk about the specific meeting with Kamala Harris. It was surprising for me that after bluntly criticizing President Bukele of Guatemala and his actions, she didn't say anything against López Obrador. She didn't touch anything about corruption, about insecurity in Mexico. She said nothing. What do you think that is?
I'll start if you want briefly, because I think they know that the U.S. knows that in order to control, again, it comes back to the same thing we've talked about before. Biden this year, at least, the one weak spot in his policy positions and in his first 100 days and now the remainder of his first year, the big weak spot is immigration, at least as far as independents in the U.S. see it, that weird, almost non-existent group of independents that still are so important anyway, right? They and Republicans see the situation at the border as being a crisis, and they see it as being a Biden-created crisis. I don't think I necessarily agree with that last proposition, but that's how they're seeing it. And so in order to control that, the U.S. simply needs Mexico on its side in trying to control the flows of Central Americans through Mexico to the U.S., both with support from Mexican National Guards people on the U.S.-Mexico border, but also on the Mexico-Guatemala border. And that's just a reality. It's just what it is. So I think that's why. And at the same time, right, maybe the fact that López Obrador sent this message about U.S. aid funding this group made it less important for Harris to have to say anything, right? Because kind of the U.S. is already saying what it needs to say in some ways by U.S. aid supporting groups like this that are against corruption, that are against impunity. And by the way, right, as far as I understand that this group is not a partisan group, they don't actively support. Right, they're a nonpartisan NGO. They've been critical of previous governments as well. They're simply also critical of this government, as many of us are. Right, I'm personally, I'm not against this particular government. I've been critical of it in certain ways. I've also been critical of every single other government Mexico has had, pretty much back to like the 1940s. And so, that's how I think a lot of us feel. And there are groups like this are doing it. So my point is, I don't know if Harris had to bring it up because basically the US is already sending the message it wants to send through US aid support for groups like this. And on the other hand, it probably wasn't a great thing it wouldn't have been great for Harris to bring it up and also try to get the support from Mexico that the US needs to control the migrant situation at the border. I'm hoping that by next year, the Biden administration will have a much better grip on what's happening at the border. I think they will. They inherited a broken system from the Trump administration that was lacking in so many ways, and they've been trying to fix it since. So I'm hoping by next year, once that is more under control, then the US will be able to move on to more topics with Mexico, even though, as we know, other topics are being addressed, such as climate change.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point. And there's also the fact that VP Kamala Harris is visiting Mexico 2 days after the midterm elections. Toño, what do you think of this visit? Do you think it sends kind of a political message? Because while it's not happening before the election, it has been announced before the election, and it will be literally like 2 days after. And here in Mexico, people can still contest some elections results, so they can recount them. So it's not definitive.
Yeah, we already know that the migration crisis is the largest crisis, the biggest one that this administration, Biden's administration, has faced and probably will face in the following months, because again, the health crisis is still a crisis, but it has been almost controlled. We expect by the 4th of July to get back to normality and have the situation controlled, at least domestically speaking, not globally. But Kamala Harris has been appointed to be in charge of the southern border affairs. And southern border affairs for the United States means the cooperation and the dialogue between Mexico and the United States too. So she didn't have any reasons to antagonize against President López Obrador in the meeting. It wouldn't have been a smart move to make, especially considering that the United States relies on Mexico's National Guard having troops in the borders, both Mexico's southern border and the United States southern border, to avoid migrants to get in. We saw the terrible situation where there were children trying to cross the border by themselves, most of them in terrible conditions, not only weather conditions, but also in inhumane conditions. They were not eating, they were not having any water to drink. They were exposed to be kidnapped by the drug cartels, by the organized crimes. Again, it was a critical situation that Kamala Harris sees López Obrador and his government as part of the solution. Again, this regional address solution to migration, Mexico has to be part of it. We're the middle country, and also the country that still is sending migrants. At the end of the day, it's not only Central American migrants, but also Mexican migrants are going to the United States at this point. She didn't have any reasons to antagonize to President López Obrador in this meeting. I think she did the right move. She talked about pretty specific topics that were supposed to be addressed in the meeting. She didn't went out of the box that she was supposed to stay in. Again, there are still a lot of issues regarding the bilateral situation, the electric and the fossil fuels reforms.
Yeah.
Sorry?
The oil and gas reform.
Yeah, the oil and gas and fossil fuels reforms that President López Obrador is passing through Congress are really worrying most of the United States investors, because they're promoting an unfair competition against the United States enterprises and the Mexican state-owned enterprises, such as CFE, or Federal Electric Commission, and Pemex, which is a Mexican oil company, basically. And yes, I believe what Kamala Harris did was diplomatic, was smart, and was according to the situation of the talk. Probably López Obrador was expecting her to be a little bit more rough, because again, López Obrador likes having not an adversary, but having an opposition figure to him, so he can point out, yes. tend to antagonize. And I think Kamala did the right move. Let's see what happens when she visits Mexico after the election. But I think this first bilateral meeting was pretty successful.
Yeah. So basically, well, specific details of what went down in the meeting haven't been released. We know by foreign policy that they had kind of like an hour conversation where they talked about this $45 billion joint development plan over 5 years to help assist in southern Mexico with the border. And this would include a partnership with USAID, the same organization that AMLO just criticized. So it appears, according to the same foreign policy, that Harris is trying to resurrect the Alliance for Prosperity that Biden had as a project back in 2014, while AMLO is more focused on the Sembrando Vidas program, which is basically, he has this program here in Mexico where people get paid to plant trees, but it has been heavily criticized because people are taking advantage of it by deforesting zones and then replanting them so that they will get the money. And he wanted to extend this into Central America, but he wanted to do this with US money. So he would technically was violating his principle of non-intervention because he was telling the US what to do. But my question for both of you is, what do you think will be the best approach or the more realistic approach? Is it bringing back the Alliance for Prosperity, where basically they help tackle the roots of migration with dealing with corruption and all of the negative trends in Central America? Or do you think a program more like Sembrando Vidas will be? And just as a note, the Sembrando Vidas program would also turn into kind of this modern day Bracero program where after working for a certain amount of years, they would be able to apply for residency, which is not something that happens in the Mexican version of it.
Yeah, so one, I don't think it's a one or the other scenario. I think multiple programs could be put into place at once. And just to clarify a little bit for our viewers who might not be familiar with it, Sembrando Vidas is a program that, first and foremost, currently, right now, is a program that President López Obrador instituted in Mexico, as Valeria said, to help essentially the poorest of the poor in Mexico, who tend to be rural people. Mexico urbanized heavily from the 1980s through today. It is still urbanizing now, basically because small farmers were no longer able to compete with the large agricultural corporations that ended up producing a lot of the produce, right? A lot of the agricultural products in Mexico. And so these small farmers sold their land for cheap, moved into the city, and now sort of constitute this other issue, which is this mass of urban poor who live in the outskirts of Mexico City and other cities. But this program in particular is trying to help the people who do remain in these rural areas, about 20 to 25% of the Mexican population, to basically be able to survive in those areas. The program says, look, many areas of Mexico have been deforested over the last century in order to promote economic development, whether it's farming, whether it's other industries. And now you have lots of economic consequences from that, not just the fact that we have less forests capturing carbon dioxide, but also issues with soil erosion, all sorts of things. And so the program says, look, if you stay in your land and you basically plant a bunch of trees and care for these trees on your land, the government will pay you about 5,000 pesos a month, which is about $250 a month. That might not sound like a lot to you guys in the States, right? But here, that salary would put those people into the middle class. That's a middle class salary in Mexico when compared to the minimum wage and what people make. So for a lot of rural people, that's great, right? Getting those 5,000 pesos a month to care for trees is huge. It lets them stay in their homes. It lets them make a decent living, and it reforests. So in theory, this program is not bad, I don't think, at least from my perspective. It's a program that could work. And the idea is also, if you can stay on your land, then you don't need to migrate, right? You don't need to migrate into the cities in Mexico, but also you don't need to migrate to the United States. So the plan in theory is not a bad one. The issues are that, one, there are some questions about transparency. The Mexican government, for example, has not published where those plots are located, as far as I understand it. So it's not clear what pieces of land are actually being farmed, basically becoming tree farms, right, or tree producing areas in this way. So the Mexican government reports numbers and reports figures, but doesn't really say, hey, these are the different plots of land where this is happening, so nobody can go and sort of verify. And the other thing, which has been reported by Mexican media, but also by the BBC and other international media, is that there are very serious reports of people who are purposefully deforesting their land, like Valeria was saying, just so that they can replant their land and then get the money, because otherwise they don't get the money, right, to sort of maintain their forests. This has been criticized because under previous administrations in Mexico, there were programs to help people maintain the forests that already existed on their lands. And those programs have not been eliminated, but they've been cut back. So now it seems more profitable for people to cut down the forest they already have and plant new ones. So there are problems with the program as it's been implemented in Mexico. These are problems that are serious, right? But the program itself, I don't think is bad. Now, the second part of it then is extending it into Central America, and that's where the U.S. comes in, right? Because as Valeria said, President López Obrador wants to extend it into Central America, have the U.S. fund the program in Central America, at least in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And then, as she was saying, he's also proposed vaguely that people after 2 or 3 or 4 years of working the land in their own countries would be given sort of these temporary worker visas to the U.S. And then eventually he's proposing that they would get some sort of permanent residency or citizenship even in the U.S. So that's sort of the second part of the program. That's what he's proposing. That has not happened yet, right? It's something he's talked about. But the program in Mexico already exists as I described.
Antonio, what do you make of it?
Yes.
Do you think more of an alliance of prosperity approach will be best, or is it creating programs like Sembrando Vida? It doesn't necessarily have to be Sembrando Vida.
Okay, I agree that both countries are identifying and recognizing that there are some root problems that cause migration to happen. Migration of those extensions that we have seen in the last years that have been a problem for the US and Mexico for many, many years, not something new. And addressing and tackling these root causes of migration seems to be a logical strategy, a pretty reasonable strategy for both governments to take. I don't know if Sembrando Vida or Jóvenes Sembrando Vida, which is the official name of this program that was one of the main public policies implemented by López Obrador administration when he got elected in 2018, will be the ultimate solution to the migration problems, because again, not everyone that is migrating wishes to stay in their countries just for work purposes. There are other causes of migration, such as insecurity, climate change. And I don't see how Jóvenes Sembrando Vida addresses such directly. Again, indirectly it can address insecurity and climate change, but directly, I don't know how it addresses this insecurity problem in Central America and the climate change situation. We have seen some flaws in the program. That's not something new. We have seen many flaws and many imperfections in other social programs. But again, I think the critical point and the one that the United States probably is the most worried about is that President López Obrador suggested that they could eventually become citizens. I don't see a possible pathway for him convincing Congress for that to happen, not even with a Democratic majority Congress, even less possible with the current Congress that is in the United States as of today. But again, the intentions are there, but I think they have to polish and the ideas and making a program that really addresses probably the 3 main causes of this migration that are, again, unemployment, insecurity, and climate change in Central America. They have to advance in baby steps. I think this is a pretty good step to begin with. And again, if both administrations recognize that they're ending in 2024, both López Obrador and Biden administration, both are ending in the same year, they have to leave a precedent for the next administrations to work with, to not leave the page blank or to start from scratch again. I do believe that there has to be some progress made to this situation, and probably Sembrando Vida is a pretty good first approach to these root causes of migration.
I agree, right? The insecurity question is the hardest one, I think, to crack, The economy question, again, this is not necessarily a bad idea, right? To find a way for people to be able to stay on their land and continue to do something on their land and make a decent living, right? Which, again, in the US, $250 a month, not really a decent living. Here in Mexico, it's at least putting you outside of sort of, the worst levels of poverty and so on. Again, in Mexico, it's sort of a middle-class salary. But yeah, the insecurity question in Central America and in Mexico, but especially in Central America, is hard, right? I mean, again, as we've said before, most of these folks are not leaving because they're looking for democracy or something like that, right? They're leaving because they're hungry, or they're leaving because they're unsafe. And in Central America, it tends to be even more heavily because they're unsafe. So how do you address that? Does this address it? No. But again, I'm not sort of in this camp that says, oh, well, it's a terrible program. I don't think so. I think it actually could be a program, Sembrando Vidas, that could work, at least in Mexico, that might alleviate some issues in Central America, but it can't be a be all and end all. And while I think the US might be open to supporting something like that financially with certain conditions and so on, yeah, like Toño, like you say, there's just no way that the US Congress is going to approve some sort of path to citizenship for people who are in this program, or even a path to residency. Just not going to happen, right? I mean, we'll be lucky if we get something during the Biden administration to address the 11 million undocumented people who are already in the US. Even that, I think, is unlikely to happen because of how divided Congress is. So yeah, this program is helping, and I think could help people in Mexico, maybe to some degree in Central America. Is it going to solve the immigration problem? No. Is it going to solve the environmental problems? No, right? Especially if people keep deforesting their land just to reforest it. So there's certain questions there, but it's not a terrible program. It's not a terrible idea. It just needs a better implementation.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. It's a good program and it's a good idea. He's starting from the right place, and I think that's a high compliment for López Obrador. But I also think that his idea, while it's possible, it's not going to be fully possible, as you both said. It's very hard. We've seen it with DACA, which is an American program, and we've seen all the trouble that people have gone through to either get it, then Trump suspended it, then it was just reactivated again. And that's people that have been living in the US, that have been paying taxes in the US, that have studied, that have worked in the US. So if there's that whole trouble for Republicans, for people that do all of that in the US, then I don't see an easy pathway for Republicans to accept it for people that aren't living in the US and that are
It's
not.
a totally different scenario. It's just a totally different scenario, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's much easier to convince people that you should allow citizenship for people who arrived in the US as children, who've grown up in the US, who speak English as a first language, who've gone to school there, who studied, who've worked, who pay taxes, everything you just said, right? That's one scenario. And then suddenly say, oh, well, we're going to also let all these other people in who are not in the country currently and give them a pathway to citizenship in just a few years. It's just not going to happen. I mean, even if anybody thought that was a good idea, which I'm not necessarily saying it wouldn't be, but even if everybody agreed that was a good idea, in practice, it's not going to happen in the U.S. Congress, and that's just it, right? And this is something that cannot be done by the president unilaterally. It would have to go through Congress. So, I mean, it's dead on arrival, right? It's a non-starter right from the beginning. And so whatever program does end up coming out of this, if anything, it's not going to include a pathway to residency or citizenship. I mean, that's just fact. There's just no other way around it.
Yeah, that's just a
And again, it's not even the United States president who's suggesting it. It's Mexico's president. So there's no way.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not against presidents suggesting things to each other. I think that's fine. It doesn't, I don't see that as any influence on the other country. You're simply saying, hey, we have a common problem. I think this is something that maybe will work, and then it's up to the other country to say yes or no, right? So I don't have a problem with López Obrador suggesting things to Biden and basically saying, hey, this might be something that works or doesn't work. I'm sure that Vice President Harris made it very clear that the way he's proposing it at least won't work. The question is then, can you come up with something else that is going to try to address these root causes, that is going to try to address climate change? The U.S. has wanted to keep both issues separate, as we know, right? Climate on the one hand, migration on the other. I'm not entirely sure that you can keep it separate. The issues are interrelated, and if you can find a solution to both of them, or at least something that helps alleviate the immigration push on the United States and climate change, I don't think that's a terrible idea at all. It's just a matter of what can you implement, both in terms of politics, right, in both countries. If López Obrador's party loses the House of Representatives and Mexico Chamber of Deputies in next month's election, that could change a lot of things in Mexico in terms of policy. But secondly, can you find something that is actually going to achieve your goals? And so that's where I think both governments need to be focused. I think both governments are also going to try to do things they need to do for political reasons, maybe more so in Mexico right now than in the US because of the proximity of the elections. But, both governments, I think, hopefully realize they have to work within reality.
Yeah, I think it's great to share policies. I think the biggest problem and the biggest criticism with the way that this policy has been shared is that President López Obrador has been criticizing other countries for even suggesting anything about his politics, and then he goes and does the same. So I think that's the big problem with, like you said at the beginning of the show, there's this whole non-intervention doctrine, and for López Obrador, it seems to be very black and white, like I can do it, but they cannot do it to me. So I think that's the biggest criticism, but it's also quite naive to think that it's not important to share policies in the globalized world that we live in. And I think with that, we can have our closing statements. If you have anything else to add for this topic. And I think in the future, we can also touch a bit more on the midterm elections as they get near. Because even though they might not affect the US directly, they certainly will if President López Obrador gets the majority in Congress again. The reforms that he passed in the last month, right ahead of the election, were worrisome. A lot of them were unconstitutional. So it's a bit worrisome to see what will happen if he gets a majority. And there's also some big states like Nuevo León that are electing governors, some border states, again, Nuevo León, Baja California, that are also electing governors. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be great. If I think next episode, for those of you who are interested in Mexican politics, we can take a deep dive into that. And also, it does affect the U.S., right? I mean, I think it's easy for us, maybe in the U.S., as Americans, to think that, like, we don't know anything about Mexico. That's the reality, right? On average. But at the end of the day, it matters, right? I mean, who the governors in places like Nuevo León. Nuevo León is the state that has the second largest city in the country, Monterrey, which is very close to the U.S. border, about 3 hours away, right? Baja California is a state that has Tijuana. So, I mean, what happens in these states and in these cities in Mexico matters to the U.S., at least to border states. And again, what happens with the Chamber of Deputies, that's the lower house of Congress here, if López Obrador loses his majority there, then that could change what he can and cannot do quite a bit, right? Especially if that opposition ends up sort of coalescing into a single force to oppose him, which I don't think that's guaranteed. Yeah, so and that could change what Mexico can and cannot do vis-a-vis the U.S. Yeah, so there's a lot to talk about there. It's coming up literally in a few weeks, and it's something that we can take a deep dive into and then see also after the fact, right, how it plays out and what impacts we think it will have specifically for the U.S.
I agree. The following points regarding the U.S.-Mexico relation will have friction because it will be the economic side of the relation. After migration is at some point controlled and the health crisis is almost over, the focus of the attention, not only of the President of the United States, but there are lots of congressmen in the United States, Senate and House of Representatives, that are asking officials such as the United States Trade Representative to be more harsh on Mexico's reforms on oil, on fossil fuels, and also in the electric reform, because they're violating at some point the agreements, international agreements that both parties are part of, such as TEMEC. And also, let's remember that this administration will want to pass a tax reform in 2021. President López Obrador said that he was going to do a tax reform after the elections, because he wants to reaffirm that he will have again the great majority to pass legislation quite easily. But yes, the challenges are not over. There will be lots of more challenges regarding the U.S.-Mexico relations. And after the elections, it will be a breaking point to see how is the ground regarding the the relation.
Yeah, I think you both sum it up pretty well. This is it for this episode of Questionnaire here at the Build Lab, and we will see you next week again at 4 p.m. here at the Build Lab. Thank you for joining, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Valeria.